Good afternoon. I am delighted to welcome all of you to the presidential lecture for the spring of 2008, and I'm trying to figure out how many we've had. But since the spring of 2001, we have been holding these lectures. Some of you are loyal supporters who have been here from the very beginning, and those of you who have been here from the beginning, I think you have. I thank you for your support and for being here. For those of you who are new to the series, let me tell you that the purpose of the series is really to bring out the beauty and frankly, the intellectual power of the City University of New York and the intellectual power of Queensborough Community College together in this series that in the fall celebrates one of the CUNY greats, and in the spring celebrates one of our Queensborough Community College greats. So the purpose is that in the fall lecture, and by the way, we have someone of the name of Eric Alderman for the lecture in the fall, right before the election, which is going to be a great one. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, because I don't want to detract from the one that we have today. Today we have with us a tremendous individual. One of the things that is happening at this institution and other institutions across the country is that those of us who are older, not old, but older, are beginning to leave space for those of you who are younger. And there's a transformation that is taking place in the university, specifically in the American University. And the transformation is the realization of the importance of undergraduate education while maintaining a real keen eye on the importance of research as Research One institutions, of the high-end research institutions. But there are a number of individuals who have chosen to go and teach rather than go to the universities that specify only research. And I am delighted to tell you that Dr. David Humphries is one of those individuals. I remember interviewing David now 4 years ago, and I'm being extremely impressed with this young man who was coming out of the graduate center. And I asked him, well, what other places have you applied to? And he started rattling off names. I'm not going to embarrass you with them. But these were all Tier 1 universities. And there was no community college among the places that he had interviewed at and had been offered at. And I said, well, why are you coming to Queensborough? What attracts you to Queensborough? And he said, well, the teaching that takes place here. The idea that we're not only just providing and disseminating information, but we are investigating how that information is disseminated, that we're engaged in the study of pedagogy. He was very much attracted to the fact that we are a place where we look at the student in a holistic manner, that we look at the student as an individual that grows in a supported environment. And those are important words for this cadre of young faculty members that are coming out. We've hired individuals who come from very prestigious institutions, like the Graduate Center, who could go anywhere in this country and who have elected to be among us. So I am delighted to celebrate one of our young, old, great individuals today's lecture, to provide him with the forum to share with you some of his thoughts about the lost generation and the burning of Smyrna. And he is an individual who, by the way, just to give you, you all have it, but I'll just highlight it. He has earned the Lane Cooper Fellowship for Studies in Humanities and the Alfred Kazin Prize for Best Dissertation in American Literature and Culture. So we're talking about a true scholar, a gifted teacher, and a good friend. David? I have a request, because we have a very important guest in the audience, and in CUNY there's a tradition of making certain that all of the important guests are recognized. But this gentleman is really very, very special, and since he is a personal friend of our dear Dr. Gillespie, I asked her to introduce him.
This is a very joyous occasion for Queensborough and for CUNY. One of the reasons that the CUNY graduates, particularly in English, are very interested in teaching is that several of them have had the honor of working with Bill Kelly, who is now and has been for several years, the president of the Graduate Center. Lest you think this happened by chance, I want you to know that on January 12th, Linda Stanley and I went to visit our very good friend, and we stayed with him for an hour. And then before we left, I gave him the date, and I said, Bill, put it on your calendar. It's there, and he's here. So we are really delighted that we have so many graduates from Graduate Center on our faculty across the disciplines. And as the president said, David Humphries represents a new breed of faculty who have chosen to serve in a public university, and we are honored to have Bill Kelly as our president.
Good afternoon. I have some thanks to give. First of all, I'd like to thank President Marti and the committee for inviting me here to speak today. It's a great honor and one which I gladly accept. I'd like to thank all my friends. I see even some of the evening faculty who share the night shift with me here tonight. I appreciate one of the things we're very blessed with on this campus. We have so many events and so many things going on, so I appreciate you taking the time to be here today. In particular, I'd also like to thank Samantha Thacker for doing the publicity. I don't see her right now. Hi. Everyone was very impressed with the brochure. It made me look good. And by everyone, I mean my parents, my Aunt MJ, and others in Ohio who I mailed this to. Thank you. I'd also like to thank all the students who are here. I hope you get something out of the talk besides extra credit. Some of you could use the extra credit too, so that's good. I'd like to thank the members of the Queensborough community and the people who have traveled here to our campus today. I hope you feel welcome and enjoy the talk. And finally, I guess I'd have to pick up from what Dr. Gillespie was saying. I've been very fortunate in my time at the Graduate Center and teaching in the CUNY system to get to know some really outstanding colleagues, scholars. But there are a couple people who stand out for what they teach you, things you really can't learn in a book, things that you take with you when you leave the classroom. And I've been very fortunate to have a few people like that in my career. One of them, I think, is very familiar to all of us, Dr. Gillespie, who just spoke. I think my friend Joan. When I arrived here, there were, I believe, 6 new faculty, and I think all 6 of us were happy that CUNY had made the investment in our future and the future of CUNY. And I think all of us in the English department would agree that we couldn't ask for a better mentor or chair than Dr. Gillespie. Now, second of all, Dr. Kelly has a lot of friends. I like to think I'm one of them. And I was very fortunate when I was at the Graduate Center that he was on my dissertation committee. And although when he was provost, I would be in his office asking him very mundane questions about footnotes and the more obscure works of Robert Penn Warren, and the secretary would come, we've got a fax, you have to fax the budget, $28 million, or the French consulate's on the phone. Those are more or less real examples, but I never felt slighted. In fact, I think, again, Joan and other people here will agree with me that I really benefited from every minute I spent with him, and it's a real honor to have Dr. Kelly here with us today. I appreciate that. One last thanks before I start to a couple people who traveled a little bit. My friend, Dr. Duncan Faraday, who made the trip over all the way, I believe, from Flushing. He's a professor at Queens College, and he's one of my oldest friends from the Graduate Center, so I appreciate his presence here today. And I had a lovely companion joining me on my trip from Brooklyn today, my wife, who's here today, so thank you. Now, I had a list here, but in the interest of time, I'm going to make it short, the things I can't answer. So I hope in the question and answer period, anything that comes up that I haven't touched on, the events I'm going to talk about really raise a lot of historical and cultural issues that I can't touch on. And I see there's a few historians here, so I'm looking forward to the question and answer period. What I do hope to do today in my talk is, first of all, have a little bit of reflection on the burning of Smyrna, which is a major historical event, but one that's not familiar to a lot of Americans. I'm also hoping that I can share some resources which people may find interesting in their own interest and curiosity. I'm going to look at, and we're all going to get a chance to look at, some newsreel footage of the event, which is kind of unique. Some people think it's the first catastrophe of this kind, the first time that refugees were filmed for an audience around the world, so we'll get a chance to see that today. And then finally, I'm going to look at 3 Americans who witnessed the event in different ways, and that's where I'll be a little more in my own element, getting back to the literary world and some people who are there. So let me get started. First of all, the fun part of my talk, after we see the burning, it's going to go a little bit serious, I'll be honest, but we'll start with the fun part. I know not everyone's familiar with what a newsreel is necessarily. These were short compilations of films, which were back in the days when, before television news and before really television, when people went to the movies once, twice, 3 times a week, newsreels were compilation of news, the first video news. And during the heyday of the newsreel, there were about 4 or 5 newsreels that were updated, usually twice a week, about 10 minutes long. They're not really often studied, in part for reasons we'll see, because they're considered entertainment rather than journalism, but I think they have a lot of journalistic and cultural interest. Finally, I said I wanted to share some resources. Not a lot of people are aware of this, but now we're in the digital age. The newsreels I'm going to show you are all available on the internet now. So if you have any interest in anything that happened between about 1900 and 1970, you can look up a lot of these clips yourself, which I think is pretty interesting. Here's the website, British Pathé, and you can get the idea. The Beatles, Queen Elizabeth, the Yalta Agreement, some highlights there. Now, one of the interesting things about the newsreel is that in a lot of ways, it set the program for the television news we have today. And in the interest of time, I hope you can see my slides. I'm not going to read each one fully. But basically, we have catastrophe, international celebrity, pageantry, ceremony, sports, political and military events, technology, spectacle, and novelty. Pretty much what you see on Channel 11 at 10 these days. I'm going to show an example of a newsreel. See how our sound is.
Actress Marilyn Monroe and playwright Arthur Miller are married, climaxing days of worldwide.
This is an example of a free one you can get from the website.
Poses for a battery of feverish photographers at their honeymoon retreat, the Miller Farm in Roxbury, Connecticut. Married suddenly and secretly, it's the 2nd time for the 40-year-old playwright and the 3rd for the glamorous 30-year-old actress. Next comes a film in England for Mrs. Marilyn Miller.
So those are the kinds of clips you can get at the British Pathé site. So I think it's kind of interesting. I kind of think of it as like YouTube from the dark ages, in a way. And I'll let the British Pathé, we don't want to miss the rooster. Okay. Now, one of the other things that I find interesting about the newsreel, I had an opportunity here at Queensborough talking about teaching to teach a new media class. And I also had the opportunity to do a couple linked courses with music instructors. So to be prepared, of course, I did some research on music and technology. And I found it really interesting the way in which a new media form will, in a way, create its own content and create its own perception. So for example, before 78 records came out, blues singers would have songs that basically had as many verses as they could remember or make up. When the 78 record came out, you could fit about 4 verses, and all the blues writers immediately started writing 4-verse songs. When we had the LP, or long-playing record, come out, we have longer songs, we have the rise of FM radio, and ultimately we had different styles of music. The mystery question is Led Zeppelin. So there's an example of a song that's 8 minutes and 35 seconds long. You can't really have that before. You can't really have that before you have LP records. Well, in the case of the newsreel, and I know Dr. Kelly's a big boxing fan, and Duncan's Irish, so here we have Irish boxers. See if we see any pretenders or claimants to the throne here. Well, boxing and the history of boxing in the newsreel, just like I was talking about the length of music affected the content, the early newsreel cameras, as you can see here, didn't move very easily, and they actually had reels. And the reels would play for 3 or 4 minutes. You couldn't really film baseball that way, or football, or soccer. So the two sports that were really promoted through the newsreel were boxing and horse racing, because you knew how long it would be and where the action would be. And if you look at the cultural history of boxing, I showed my class this term the Jack Johnson, one of my classes, the Jack Johnson documentary. The moment Jack Johnson, who became the first black heavyweight, knocked out John Jeffries, who was the white champion, they cut the newsreel. They never showed the white audience a white champion losing. And shortly thereafter, they passed the Sims Act, which basically said, like the Mann Act, you couldn't transport newsreel clips of boxing across state lines. Now, what does this have to do with Smyrna? I'm going to turn my attention in a moment to that. Well, one thing that I find interesting about the history of the newsreel is they didn't have the same ideas about ownership we do today. The sports writer said, I can write about any event I see, therefore I should be able to film any event I see. And it took quite a few years. In Great Britain, they were a little more respectful of property rights. But in the United States, they would frequently try to sell exclusive rights to boxing matches, to horse races, and almost all of them were pirated. Once the cameras got smaller, people would sneak cameras in. It took a long time to really wrestle with this idea of who owns an image, which I think will come up again in a moment. Now, a lot of people aren't familiar with Smyrna, or which today is the modern Greek or Turkish city of Izmir. I was trying to think of a way to summarize what Smyrna is or was. In my own estimation, I would say it was the New Orleans of the Mediterranean world. It was very cosmopolitan, somewhat known to be somewhat risque, a place you could go and have a good time, very diverse city, and really one of the most important port cities from ancient times up until, I guess you could argue, the present, but certainly till 1922. Now I'm going to show in just a moment the newsreel, which, as I mentioned, I actually paid for this one. It's a high-resolution copy of the Burning of Smyrna, which is one of the first times that an event like this was captured on film. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Smyrna. So here's the newsreel film. One thing I want to point out as it begins, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Smyrna while it's playing. But one of the things you'll notice is that there were Allied warships in the harbor. Smyrna has a wonderful harbor. Izmir has a wonderful harbor where the ships were only about 100 yards from the quayside. And while the fires were going on, there were actually hundreds of thousands of refugees. The ships were only 100 yards away. And for 2 weeks, they did absolutely nothing to help the people there. And it's amazing. When you see some of the newsreel footage, you can see just how close the ships were. So one of the things, I'm very humbled, I see a few historians here. When I first heard of Smyrna, I thought, well, how did the Greeks get there anyway? It turns out you have to read several books that are about 400 pages long. It's very hard to explain that. And one of the things I also realized, why did my high school and college professors always skip over World War I? It's because it's so complicated. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, which became the modern nation of Turkey, it wasn't clear which side they would fight on, and the same went for the Greeks. The Ottomans had a lot of French influence, some British sympathizers. Ultimately, they entered the war on the side of the Axis powers, Germany and Austria. And one of the reasons they did that at the last moment, Winston Churchill decided not to deliver a ship that the Ottomans had paid for. He was getting cold feet, thinking they might use it against the British Navy. Decisions like that actually played into the futures of nations and hundreds of thousands and millions of lives lost. In the case of the Greeks, again, it's very interesting to look and see the royal families involved. King Constantine, his wife happened to be the sister of the Kaiser. That made him under a bit of suspicion from the Allies. And for a long time, the Greeks were neutral. And of course, I can't even begin to describe the politics of the time. Eventually, Venizelos got the Greeks to come in on the side of the Allies. And one of the fruits of their endeavors was the granting of Smyrna. And interestingly, the other thing I found out is our President Woodrow Wilson, I should say right away, I would much rather have President Marty or President Kelly go to the peace talks in Paris. I have no doubt they would have done a better job. He was played like a fiddle by the Europeans. So he was against the Greeks getting Smyrna, but he was even more against the Italians getting Smyrna. And the Italians sent 2 warships there. The Italian diplomats were off to lunch. And finally, Lloyd George, the British envoy, convinced Wilson to go ahead and give it to the Greeks. He said, well, we can't have the Italians get it, so I guess we'll give it to the Greeks. The result in 1922, at the end of this period, so the Greeks took possession of Smyrna and the environment in 1919. In 1922, the Greeks were losing the war, and the burning of Smyrna is one of the concluding events of that. Very controversial, and I could talk more about that in the question and answer period. But basically what happened was this. On September 5th, this all happened in 1922, the burning of Smyrna. On September 5th, about 30,000 refugees a day started arriving in Smyrna from the outlying areas, primarily Armenians and Greek Christians. On September 8th, 1922, the last Greek soldiers as well as the governor left. On September 9th, the first Turkish soldiers entered, more or less without incident, although on that day they did lynch and dismember the last leader of the Greek church. So you can imagine there was some unease there. On September 11th, there were some small fires, and then on September 13th, 1922, the entire Christian corner basically went up in flames, to great controversy to this day. A few days later, on September 16th, the Turks declared that all Armenian and Greek men aged 18 to 45 were considered prisoners of war, which made it very difficult for families to escape in one piece if they had male members of the family. Finally, and this is what I was talking about earlier, for those 2 weeks from the time the Turkish army entered until September 24th, the Allies, and there were about 22 Allied ships in the harbor, Italians, French, British, and Americans. It wasn't until September 24th that any systematic evacuation really started. So that's kind of one of the questions that's raised about Smyrna, is why nothing was done. And one of the questions I can't really answer is, at what point does a nation really put its interest in humanity over its national interest? The Italians, as I mentioned, they wanted to start an empire. They owned Rhodes and some other places in the Mediterranean. They were in pretty good terms with the Turks, but they wanted more. The French had an investment in the Baghdad to Berlin Railroad, and they thought, we've defeated the Germans, we'd like to get our investment. The British and Americans were in a little different position. The British, who were seen rightly so as encouraging the Greeks on this adventure, really counted on Lloyd George as their main advocate. He had lost influence, and the British were already looking at the southern part of the Ottoman Empire, places we've all heard of, Mosul and Basra, because they had a lot of oil. And Winston Churchill was no dummy in terms of the Navy. He wanted to make sure the Navy had free passage and they had oil to power their ships. The Americans, why didn't we do anything for 2 weeks when our ships, in fact, you can see a few American ships were among the closest there. Well, we had never declared war on the Ottoman Empire. We entered late, they didn't do very well, and we never had to declare war on the Ottomans. And so we were already looking ahead to gain our own advantages. For those of you who are oil conspiracy people, it's probably not a coincidence that there was a large Standard Oil depot at Smyrna, and the United States also had an interest in the southern part of the Ottoman Empire where all the oil was. So those are some of the reasons why this took place, why nothing was done. Now I mentioned why is this the first newsreel footage of something? And this gets to a little bit of my talk because people think the Lost Generation, World War I, and then the Lost Generation. Well, no one had really seen images like this for the reasons, this is why I mentioned the boxing incident. During World War I, the cameras were big, on tripods. They looked like guns. Cameramen didn't like to go in areas and set up something that looked like a gun because they would get shot at pretty quickly. The other thing was, this is in the days before satellite and cable. You had to transport the actual reels of film, and you had to get the camera to the front line and then get the film back. It was very easy to censor World War I, and so World War I was almost completely censored. So I think the burning of Smyrna, I think, raises, and here we have some of the shots of the refugees, raises some issues about the way war is filmed. Basically, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, the Burning of Smyrna gave cameraman the first time in the Greco-Turkish War, gave cameraman the first opportunity to actually film combat and the effects of war on civilians. Now, because the international community didn't act, there are a lot of stories, and some people here may know of some as well. A lot of people who survived the Burning of Smyrna came down to personal favors and connections and things because the international community was so slow to act. Aristotle Onassis, a name that's pretty familiar, was probably the most famous Greek to escape from Smyrna. Of course, it helped if you had money, especially in the days before the Turks had declared everyone POWs. In other cases, the French, because they were on good terms with the Turks, didn't have to keep their neutrality quite as much. And the French were pretty open. This was filmed by a Frenchman, by the way. You can see a lot of French flags. The French were more open. If you could say in French, I lost my passport, I was born in Paris, they gave you a visa. The Italians were also on good terms with the Turks, and to extend their influence, they had given Italian passports to many of the Sephardic Jews who lived in Smyrna to say, hey, Italians live there. And that the Jewish quarter wasn't really damaged by the fire, and many of them carried Italian passports, so they were largely unaffected by the fire. So a lot of very personal issues of money, and in some cases personal favors were the difference between life or death. The newsreel gives the figure 2,000 died at Smyrna during the fire and the aftermath. That's the figure of the Admiral Bristol, who was the American ranking officer there. He was pretty pro-Turkish. George Horton, who wrote a book that a lot of people cite and flame each other over on the internet, he was very anti-Turkish, and he said he thought 100,000 people died. So it's one of those where I think it's safe to say a lot more than 2,000 people died, but probably a lot less than 100,000. But it was a significant amount of bloodshed. Now here, again, these are one of the interesting things about having the opportunity today to show this is, unlike television news today, this footage would have been seen in a theater, which I think creates a very different reaction of shame, I think, for people that they couldn't do anything. The other thing, which I'll come back to, is the film was actually taken of the city burning from a warship. So it must be interesting, the cameraman was on board, the soldiers aren't doing anything to help, and yet here he is also just filming it. So again, these are some of the first shots. We have bread lines. Bread lines. Don't worry, the talk's going to get a little more positive because I'm going to talk about 3 Americans who were there in one way or the other to witness this or witness the evacuation. The other thing I want to mention before the newsreel is over, it has the date 1931. This newsreel was later shown in a compilation. It was considered an ultimate scoop. And Jack Cohen, who was the kind of the editor of British Pate, would show it to all the new newsreel cameramen. Here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to do. So this, what we're seeing today, is a scoop from 1922. And I think I'll end it there. It's just about done. These are refugees from other parts of Anatolia. I think this, we've already seen this part, but I'll let it go for one more second. One of the problems in terms of trying to figure out who died there, a lot of people had mixed ancestry, and a lot of Greeks put on the fez. They spoke Turkish, so who was going to know whether they were Christians or not? So it's very difficult, and like we said, the Armenians who said they were French or American, it's very hard to know exactly how many people died. Now, I'm going to move ahead. It is pretty shocking, I have to admit, when you do the research on this. One of the things, again, I think there's an element of shame here. Rather than help the refugees who were only 100 yards away, they would shoot searchlights on them each night with the hope that the Turkish marauders and all the raping, looting, and slaughtering would stop. But they could hear the screams. And so there are a lot of reports that the officers, the naval officers, would just put up their record players. Put up the record players because they were under strict orders to maintain neutrality. This one's probably one of the most shocking and has to do with, as I move on with my talk, It's by an Armenian man who actually swam out to one of the British ships, had hot water poured on him, had to swim back, had a searchlight on him, which made him an easy target, and he realized while he was doing all that, they were filming him. So again, I think the Burning of Smyrna definitely raised a lot of questions about journalism and the role of journalists. It's going to get better, because I'm going to talk about a few. Now, I know a lot of people here at Queensborough are interested in health sciences, and one of the witnesses, not of the burning, but of the evacuation, is a really remarkable American doctor, Esther Lovejoy. She was, I believe, the second woman in the state of Oregon to earn her MD. So it was a time when there were very few female physicians. She was instrumental in starting a group called the American Women's Hospital, which was like Doctors Without Borders. And they basically went to places like Smyrna, Greece, Armenia, the Balkans, and set up hospitals for refugees and people who were underserved. And it's an amazing book. It's actually, again, one of the resources I'd like to share if you're interested. Her book, Certain Samaritans, the whole text is available online. There's also a lecture by a professor at the University of Western Oregon, Kimberly Jensen, and she has a biography coming out. So I think if you're interested in women's health issues, it's an amazing book, very witty as well. She's a good writer. And she talks about being there at Smyrna during this systematic evacuation. There's really no such thing as an objective observer, in my opinion. And you can see she takes a Christian perspective. However, I should mention their hospitals did not discriminate in any way. So she's a pretty good observer. If you're also curious about what happened at Smyrna, she gives a pretty, I don't want to say objective, but a pretty fair account. One of the things I think that's interesting, we think about what happened during the Great War and the aftermath. She says, well, how did I end up getting there? She says, well, you'd have to go back and rewrite the history of feminism, but it also had to do with a simple phrase the French used, c'est la guerre. The war changed everything. During World War I, female physicians were not really permitted to assist the Red Cross. After the war, they had all these refugees. The Red Cross, their resources were strained, and the Red Cross and the Near East Relief worked with Dr. Lovejoy and her colleagues. One of the things I find fascinating about her, and she brings it up here, the sick tell few tales and the dead tell no tales. And she realized the 20s are the time when publicity and advertising really take off. And she realized she knew this was important, but never was able to really capitalize on fundraising and getting the work out that they did to the public who could give money, that they could do more work. Today, I think when we look at the categories of the newsreel, if something bad happens, we just wait for Angelina Jolie to show up. George Clooney's talking about Darfur. Those boundaries weren't really, in the time of the newsreel, you didn't really see celebrities talking. Dr. Lovejoy could have used some celebrities. It's interesting, about 3 or 4 years after Smyrna, they were still operating hospitals in Greece for refugees. They had a huge spread in the National Geographic, and they just referred to their group as that useful American organization. They didn't even mention the American Women's Hospital, so that even when they got good publicity, they didn't know how to follow up on it. Today, the American Women's Hospital is part of the American Medical Women's Association, and the first thing they tell you is, please give us some money because we're doing a great job. So times have changed. Dr. Lovejoy, on her way to Smyrna, met a pretty interesting character named Shorty. Like a lot of nicknames, he was really tall and a little on the heavy side. And Shorty was a newsreel cameraman. He was there for the scoop. I've used his default photograph because not much is known about Shorty. One of the things I mentioned, Dr. Lovejoy is a pretty witty writer, and to her, she's going to Smyrna to help refugees, and she realized Shorty was rather agitated for another reason. He was worried that the Turks might attack in Constantinople, and he would have the wrong scoop, that the refugee story would be wiped out by the attack story. Fortunately for everyone involved, including Shorty, he was wrong. Now, as I mentioned, personal favors sometimes in a refugee situation where international observers aren't doing much could be the difference between life and death. Turns out it was important that Shorty was a big man because one of the Armenian cooks had a brother who was hiding in an attic, and it was impossible for an Armenian man to escape Smyrna at that point. And Dr. Lovejoy said, listen, cook, I don't care who goes hungry, give Shorty the best dinner. And that's what she did. That's what she did. And sure enough, Shorty went out with his press credentials as if he were going to take some photographs. And rather than taking a photograph, he had the woman dress up as a sick soldier and her brother dress up as a sailor, and he was able to smuggle these 2 Armenians on board a ship and save their lives. And Dr. Lovejoy is a pretty witty writer. She says that that night at dinner, it was the worst dinner they ever had, and Shorty was the only one who was happy because he knew it saved the life of the cook. Now, Shorty had a friend, and in the last part of my talk today, it looks like I'm on schedule, a little more famous than Esther Lovejoy or Shorty Warnall. Shorty was friends with Ernest Hemingway. And Hemingway, while Smyrna was burning, was on his way to Constantinople, where he was to cover the war and the events of the war for the Toronto Star. And an interesting side note as far as journalistic ethics, he was also selling stories to the Hearst Newswire and double dipping and really violating every rule of journalism. But while Hemingway was in Constantinople, he met up with Shorty, and Shorty had described to him what had happened at Smyrna. And of course, Hemingway, as a reporter and a man of his times, was following in the news. And I'm speculating, but I'm pretty certain Hemingway probably saw the exact same newsreel we did later. So when Hemingway's book came out in 1925, it's kind of a hard book to describe. It's a mixture of short stories and short sketches, including many that were taken from Hemingway's experience with covering the Greco-Turkish War and refugees in Thrace. He also took a lot verbatim from his friend Shorty. So one of my theories, this is where I'm going to take questions. In our time. In our time. This is where I'm a little more in my element of literature. Hemingway's book, he took quite a bit of material from Shorty. And in my opinion, the book is heavily influenced by the newsreel. And perhaps, as I'm going to argue, the newsreel we saw. Now, a lot of people say, what's In Our Time about? It's about a lot of things. In 10 minutes, I'm not going to tell you everything it's about. But I think the most important thing it's about is seeing and the ways of seeing. In the very first story, and I should mention, Hemingway wrote most of the book when he was 24. Pretty amazing. He was 23 when he was in Constantinople. In the first story, Indian Camp, a young Nick Adams, who's kind of the main character of the book, goes with his father to an Indian camp where an Indian woman is giving birth, and Nick's father, who's a physician himself, has to perform an emergency C-section with only a jackknife and some fishing line. He feels pretty good about himself until, in a typical kind of Hemingway ending, he realizes that the father of the new mother had committed suicide, couldn't take all the screaming. And at the end of the story, Nick, yeah, it's a little brutal. Nick Adams, who's the main character, he's been the intern, and he's only a young man, maybe 7, 8, 9 years old. Probably wasn't what he wanted to see when he went out in the boat that night to go to the Indian camp, and sure enough, he looks away. He looks away, and I think Hemingway's book is marked by a lot of times where characters want to look away and some where they can't look away. Now, what's particular to my talk today is that in 1930, Hemingway, long story, so I won't tell it, but he basically had screwed his first friends and his first publisher and switched to Scribners. They said, Max Perkins, one of the most famous editors, said, Hem, why don't you come out with a new version of your book? Add something. Add an introduction. He said, I'm a little busy, let's have Edmund Wilson do it. Edmund Wilson said, I'm too busy. Hemingway added a piece which was called Introduction. Later, he retitled it On the Quay at Smyrna. He'd probably written it several years after the burning of Smyrna, and this is why I believe that he had seen, not only did he know a newsreel cameraman who was there on the ships, who had seen not the burning, but the aftermath and the refugees. I'm pretty certain he had seen the same newsreel footage we had. And Hemingway's story captures a lot of the elements that I was describing that are in the newsreel. First of all, it's told through a reporter interviewing a British soldier, or naval officer, I should say, who's on board one of these ships. And it really shows how he must maintain his neutrality. A Turkish officer comes on board and says, I've been insulted by one of your British naval men. I want him punished. And the British officer says, but of course, I'm summarizing. When the Turkish officer leaves, he said, don't worry, just hide until this whole debacle is over. So he lies. He lies, and it's very petty. It's the feeling you get, it's very petty. As the story proceeds, it's very Hemingway-esque, capturing the horrors of what was there and what this officer had seen. a lot of women gave birth, and so it links with Hemingway's first story, there as refugees, and that's one of the things Dr. Lovejoy and her female physicians did, was work with women who were pregnant or giving birth as refugees. And here Hemingway captures not only the screams that the naval officers heard, but his story reproduces that exact angle of the camera and the searchlight. And now we have the British officer who's watching, but not doing anything. Not doing anything. As the story proceeds, and there's a recent article claiming Hemingway's anti-Greek, I'll let you decide. One of the controversies about the burning of Smyrna is that the Greeks, as they retreated from the area in Anatolia they controlled, followed a scorched earth policy. They burned the villages behind them, which is one of the main controversies today about the burning of Smyrna. And Hemingway, I don't know if this was true. I kind of find it hard to believe, only because a lot of the refugees were forced to eat their horses or oxen. But Hemingway describes the Greeks as nice chaps. This is the British officer speaking, because what he saw them doing was breaking the legs of their horses and pushing them into the water to drown, rather than have the Turks take their prized livestock. So it's a brutal story. I think I've captured that. But as In Our Time progresses, it becomes more and more clear that it's about Nick and the way Nick sees. And a lot of people, myself included, would argue that Hemingway hit his peak rather early, and the Big Twohearted River was his best story. And it's the culminating fiction piece in Our Time. And Hemingway, at this time, he was still friends with a woman named Gertrude Stein. I hope my English 412 students remember that name. And Stein told him, Ernie, you got to cut out all that talking in your story, but some of the talking is very interesting. And one of the things that he had said in the story that he cut out upon Gertrude Stein's recommendation was that you could capture a landscape if you lived right with your eyes. So again, his book is really about seeing. And here's Nick. It's a story about fishing. The first thing he does, he arrives in a burnout town. He sees a pool of water, very Bartram-esque. It looks like a lens. It looks like a lens when he looks down at that pool of water. And in a way, Nick, he's totally by himself. And what he has is an amazing opportunity, which is to see what he wants to see. We get the idea he may have been a soldier. I would suggest he may remember what had been seen at Smyrna. And he gets to put all that behind him. He's by himself on his fishing trip. To me, it almost reminds me of the newsreel voiceovers, which came later, but we saw with Marilyn Monroe. The words just seem to float out there, just to fit somehow. And one of the things, I'm going to wrap it up here in just a minute, but it's interesting that so many people who are at Smyrna said, what we saw couldn't be captured in words. Couldn't be captured in words, including Dr. Lovejoy, who said that what she saw at Smyrna really couldn't be captured in words. Well, as I was doing my research, I found it very interesting that a well-known critic of American literature, one actually we had at the Graduate Center when I was there as a visiting lecturer, Shelley Fisher Fishkin, she said that there's something so perfect about Hemingway's story, Big Twohearted River, it makes you feel as if words are superfluous and there's no such thing as lies. I'm paraphrasing what's here. What I found fascinating is when I went back and watched the newsreel that we saw today, it's one of the clips that says words are superfluous for a picture such as this, the tragedy of the burning of Smyrna. Well, it's really two different things, right? In the case of the newsreel, words are superfluous because supposedly, I guess one reading would be that the pictures tell the whole story. The problem is the newsreels were entertainment. They weren't very controversial. You could argue that the evening news today is similar. It didn't say who started the fire, why the Greeks were there, what had happened during their retreat. So I think words are superfluous, not because they told the whole story, but because they couldn't tell the whole story. And Hemingway's masterpiece, and he meant it to be a masterpiece, his culminating story of In Our Time, words are superfluous because words haven't failed. They've achieved everything they could be. Everything they could be. They seem true, which is a very different thing. Hemingway's story goes on for a couple more pages, a piece called L'Envoi, and it's back to Shorty. Shorty had been in Athens, and he had an interview with the Greek king, who was, in a way, one of the last victims. 5 or 6 Greek ministers were executed because of their poor performance in Smyrna. That's also in the book. And he has a quote from directly from Shorty Warnell, who said the king, like all Greeks, said that he wanted to go to America. He wanted to go to America. Well, I don't have really time here to argue how the lost generation was lost at Smyrna, but I think one way is this. Many historians who look at World War I, including the great French historian Marc Bloch, excuse my accent, said that there was something very cinematic for the soldiers who were in the Great War, World War I. But as I explained, the average person who went to the theaters to see the newsreels didn't see the war. They saw soldiers marching and shiny ambulances and diplomats. It was really only with Smyrna and with the Greco-Turkish War that the reality of war went from the theater of battle to the movie theater to people's consciousness. And I'd like to end with just a couple quick things. One is it's very interesting to me that until recently, I think Hemingway was the way people like myself first heard of Smyrna, and in a way his life was like a newsreel. It combined everything.
Death finally touches Ernest Hemingway, seen here after one of his many near escapes, a plane crash in Africa. The 61-year-old novelist died of self-inflicted gunshot at his home in Ketchum, Idaho, in which beloved spot he is to rest. His death shocked the entire world and brought tributes from people in all countries, including one from President Kennedy, who called him one of the great citizens of the world. Ernest Hemingway received many honors and medals during his lifetime, the greatest being the Nobel Prize awarded him in 1954. His fourth wife, Mary, was in the house when he died in a fashion appropriate to his stories, which were largely preoccupied with love, violence, and death.
So I found it interesting that Dr. Lovejoy never really found a way to present the image of the refugees, like the ones on the screen, to capitalize on that, to publicize the work that she had done. It's kind of interesting that Hemingway, who wasn't there but who knew Shorty, and through Shorty, I guess you could say, knew Dr. Lovejoy, his celebrity was one of the ways that people have remembered Smyrna. And I would argue that his first book, In Our Time, is in large measure a tribute or a reaction to the events that took place in September 1922 in Smyrna. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions.